We are in the virtual living room of Globus Books, and we have the series of online literary and arts events, including literary translation roundtable. Visit our store. We are open during pandemic. We are open safely. And we have the vast collections of all sorts of books on the subject of the former Soviet Union. And we are now building the collections in other languages, but for now it's mainly in Russian and English. We have a lot of wonderful translations, and we are a curated store. Obviously, a lot of the leading translators are featured during our shows, so we have a chance to showcase on our shelves some of the best translations of the Russian classics, poetry and prose. We also have a terrific children's books collection, and that includes some interesting books with great designs from 20s and 30s, an avant-garde section, terrific photo albums and art books. Today we are bringing to you trilingual reading. It's Lithuanian poetry in translation into Russian and English. I'm very excited about it. It's one of our first trilingual events, more to come. And I will be introducing to you the curator and organizer of this reading, Anna Halberstadt, who has participated in a couple of our events. She is a poet and translator with many publications. Her collection of poetry, Vilnius Diary, was published in the Mudfish Individual Poets series in 2014. She has a book, Green in a Landscape with Ashes, and poetry collection in Russian, Transit, was published in 2016, and another poetry collection in Gloomy Sun. I will pass the mic to Anna, and she will introduce our poets, Simonas Bernotas and Aušra Kaziliūnaitė.
Aušra Kaziliūnaitė is a poet and philosopher. She is one of the most distinguished poets in the young generation of Lithuanian poets, and she is an author of 5 poetry books. The FirstLithuanian Book, Concentration Camp, The Moon is a Pill, Am Crumbled Walls, There is No Sea. Kaziliūnaitė poems were translated into 16 languages. In 2018, her poetry collection of selected poems, The Moon is a Pill, was translated by Rimas Užgiris, and it was included by the literary scholar Jayde Will in the top 5 of the best English translated books written by the authors from the Baltic States. Her books received a number of prestigious awards, and she was ranked in the top 5 list of the best poetry books of 2015, participated in numerous residences and international writing programs. She is the vice chair of the Lithuanian Writers Union and main program curator and coordinator of the Literature Festival and Book Fair Books Weekend in Vilnius. Simonas Bernotas, a Lithuanian poet, translator, was born in Kaunas in 1993. He lives in Vilnius and studies intermediate literature at Vilnius University. His poetry was published in a number of literary journals and anthologies. His first book, Rave, was published in 2019, and his poetry was translated to English, Polish, and Russian. I'm very happy to be here with Aušra and Simonas. With Aušra, I worked on translating her poetry into Russian, and with Simonas, actually, we have an experience going back to SLS, translating each other's work to Lithuanian and English, and I translated 4 of his poems into English and Russian, specifically for this reading. So I'm very happy to be here with 2 very talented poets.
Nice to see you and hear you. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for inviting to this event.
Okay, so I'm going to read 4 poems from my book, Am Crumbled Walls. It was published 2016. Svetima planeta. Kompiuteris sako, atvykom. Šiaip jis nešnekus, bet jau kelias valandas plepa apie vaismedžių genėjimą. Sako, kelionės tikslas pasiektas. Kojų pirštai nutirpę. Išlipu iš kosminio laivo. Apsižvalgau. Renku mėginius žemės mokslininkams. Vaikštau po lygiai tokį pat kambarį kaip savo. Šviesmečius, aplink nėra nieko gyvo. Nėra ir užuolaidų. Lauke ramiai sninga. Kitoje gatvės pusėje langose žybsi girliandos. Vaikai stumdosi ant šaligatvio. Vien kosminė vienatvė ir uolienos.
Alien Planet, translation by Rimas Užgiris. The computer says we've arrived. It's generally not very talkative, but has been jabbering for hours now about the pruning of fruit trees. It says we have reached our journey's goal. My toes are numb. I climb out of the spaceship and look around, gathering samples for scientists. I walk about a room identical to my own. Nothing lives for light years all around. There are no curtains. It's quietly snowing outside. Garlands glitter in windows across the street. Children push and shove on the sidewalk. Nothing but cosmic loneliness and stone. Чужая планета. Компьютер говорит, приехали. Вообще-то он не разговорчив, но уже несколько часов болтает про то, как обрезать ветки фруктовых деревьев. Говорит, вы достигли цели вашего путешествия. Пальцы ног онемели, я вылезаю из космического корабля, оглядываюсь вокруг, собираю образцы почвы для исследователей, хожу по точно такой же комнате, как моя. Световые годы никакой жизни тут не было, и занавесок нет. Снаружи тихо идет снег. На противоположной стороне улицы в окнах сверкают гирлянды, на тротуаре дети толкаются. Ничего, кроме космического одиночества и камней.
Šventinis makiažas. Mačiau angelus automatais rankose. Jie liūdnai žvelgia į grindis oro uostuose ir stotise, lūkuriavo. Mačiau tėvų siųstus 8-mečius, kurie pribėgę prie žmogaus teisių aktyvistų šaukė. Kikeno. Mačiau vyrus, kurie manėsi esantis tikri vyrai, ir moteris, kurios manėsi esančios tikros moteris. Susipažindamos vietoj vardo jos sakydavo, esu to ir to moteris. Mačiau ištuštėjusius kaimus, kertamus miškus, užtvenktas upes ir mažų miestelių bažnyčias. Veidrodyje.
Holiday makeup. I saw angels with automatic rifles in their hands, staring sadly at the floor in airports and stations, waiting. I saw 8-year-olds sent by their parents, running up to human rights activists shouting, "Give us back the rainbow," giggling. I saw men who thought they were real men, and women who thought they were real women, saying in greeting instead of a name, "I am so-and-so's woman." I saw emptied villages, forests, felled, dammed rivers, and steeples of small towns in the mirror. Праздничный макияж. Я видела ангелов с автоматами в руках. Они печально разглядывали пол в аэропортах и вокзалах, ошивались там. Видела посланных родителями 8-летних, которые, подбегая к активистам, борющимся за права человека, кричали «Верните нам нашу радугу!» и хихикали. Видела мужчин, которые считали себя настоящими мужчинами, и женщин, которые считали себя настоящими женщинами. Знакомясь, вместо своего имени они говорили «Я женщина такого-то». Видела опустевшие деревни, леса, которые vырубают, запруженные реки и церквушки в местечках, в зеркале.
Patvariuose darau šalpusniai. Kada nors visi mano draugai numirs. Numirs giminaičiai ir mylimieji, numirs priešai ir nuo žemės paviršiaus dings visi kaimynai ir praeiviai, kuriuos bent kartą buvau sutikusi gatvėje. Numirs klasiokai, grupiokai, mokytojai, dėstytojai, bendradarbiai. Paskutinį kvapą išleis visi žmonės, su kuriais dėl nesuvokiamų priežasčių dėvėjau tą pat laiko uniformą, nors taip ir neteko kariauti jo mūšiuose. Numirs paukščiai, kurie anksčiau skraidė virš mano aukštai iškeltos galvos. ir amžiams nutils šunės, kuriuos išvykusi iš miesto girdėdavau staugiant šiurpulingomis naktimis. Patvoriuose dar augs šalpusniai. Ant pavėsinių sėsis nuvargusios vynogės. Bet niekas daugiau nevadins manęs vardu, o ir manęs pačios jau nebus. Ir tuomet, atsargiai, šiek tiek pakreipusi galvą, stebėsiu svetimus šunis, vynogės ir šalpusnius. Ir tuomet, pirmas sykį iš tiesų regėsiu paukščio skrydį, o pro šalį skubanti porelė su protingais žvilgsniais aplenks solelę, ant kurios sėdžiu. Jie žinos, kad kitaip nei jie. Aš iš tiesų matau paukščio skrydį. Kad esu. Visi man nepažįstami. Šunės, vynogės ir šalpusniai.
Food will grow along the fence. Someday all my friends will die. My relatives and loved ones too. My enemies will die and all my neighbors. The passers-by whom I once met on the street will vanish from the surface of the earth. My classmates and colleagues, teachers, professors, co-workers will die. All the people will breathe their last with whom I wore for reasons unknown the same uniform of time, though I never fought in any of its battles. Birds who once flew above my head held high, who will die, and the dogs I used to hear howl on spine-chilling nights outside the city will grow silent for all eternity. Coltsfoot will still grow along the fence, tired grapes will rest on arbors, but no one will call me by name, and I myself will not be. But then carefully head slightly cocked, I'll watch the strange dogs, grapes and coltsfoot, and then for the first time I'll really see the flight of birds, and the couple hurrying by will scroll their eyes along the bench on which I sit, and they will know that I see the flight of birds differently, and that I am those things I don't know, the dogs, that I am those things I don't know, the dogs, the grapes, and the colts. Мать и мачеха будет расти под забором. Когда-нибудь все мои друзья умрут, умрут родные все и все любимые, умрут враги из поверхности земли, исчезнут все соседи и прохожие, которых я хоть однажды встретила. На улице одноклассники умрут, студенты из моей группы, учителя, преподаватели, сотрудники. И спустят последний дух все люди, с которыми Бог знает почему носили мы всю ту же униформу времени, хотя нам не приходилось воевать в его боях. Умрут все птицы, которые летали над моей ввысь задранной башкой. Навеки замрут собаки, вой которых я слушала, уехав за город по леденящим дух ночам. Мать и мачеха по-прежнему будет расти под заборами, будут стоять беседки, увитые усталым виноградом, но по имени меня уж никто не назовет, да и меня самой не будет. И тогда тихонько, склонив голову на бок, я буду наблюдать чужих собак и виноград, и мать и мачеху, и тогда впервые я по-настоящему увижу, как летит птица, а пара, спешащая мимо меня, окинет взглядом понимающий меня на лавочке сидящую. Они поймут, что птичий полет я вижу по-другому, не как они, что я и есть все эти незнакомые мне вещи. Соседские собаки, мать и мачеха и виноград.
Iškamša. Taip. Vieną dieną prie konteinerio pastebėjau paukščio iškamšą. Pastebėjau ir pamiršau, bet ji manęs nepamiršo. Net ėmė persekioti. Kad ir kur eičiau, kad ir ką sutikčiau, visur mačiau nutriušusią paukščio iškamšą. Iš pradžių tiesiog apsimesdavau, kad jos nematau. Lai sau rodosi, man kas. Nei čiulbėti, nei kirsti snapų vis tiek neįstengė. Bet galiausiai visai suįžulėjo. Ėmė šmėžuoti ne tik viešose erdvėse. Įsimaišiusi tarp studentų, klausytojų, praeivių gatvėse. Rodydavosi draugų kompanijose. Nevengė patupėti ir ant artimųjų galvų. Tada bandžiau gražiuoju. Priėjau ir paklausiau jos, ką čia veikia ir ko nori ta iškamša. Bet ji tik nebyliai tupėjo. O tėvas, ant kurio galvos į galop įsitaisė, tik klausimai pažvelgė į mane. Tėti, tau ant galvos paukštis, sušnibždėjau. Bet jis numojo ranką, suprask, didelio čia daikto. Nuo tada iškamšą jau regėjau ir sapnuose, net ten negalėjau nuo jos pailsėti, beveik nebemegojau, beveik nebevalgiau, beveik nebebuvau. Matydavau ją ir toliau. Visada tokia pat sustingusi vienoje pozoje, nebylę, apipešiota. Man ėmė atrodyti, kad ji šiek tiek šypsosi. Iškamša iš mane šaipėsi. Priėjau, čiupau ją ir mečiau iš visų jėgų į sieną. Tik pasirodo, ten buvo ne siena, o veidrodis. Tąkart jame pirmą kartą išvydau skrendantį paukštį.
Stuffed. One day by the dumpster, I saw an abandoned stuffed bird. I saw it and forgot. But it didn't forget me. It even began to stalk me. Wherever and whenever I would go, whomever I would meet, I saw the ragged bird. At first, I pretended not to see it. Let it show itself. What do I care? It neither chirps nor pecks at me. But eventually, it grew rude, appearing not only in public places, among students, listeners, pedestrians, but showing up among friends, perching even on my loved ones' heads. So I tried to make nice, asking, what are you doing here and what do you want? But the stuffed thing just squatted there, silent, and my father, on whose head it eventually perched, only looked at me inquiringly. Dad, I whispered, there is a bird on your head. But he just waved his hand, you know, big deal. From that time on, I began to see the stuffed creature in my dreams. No escape. I hardly slept. I barely ate. I barely was. And I would keep seeing it, always frozen in the same pose, mute, frayed, though it began to seem to me that it was smiling. The stuffed bird was mocking me, so I finally snatched it up and threw it with all my strength at the wall, only it turned out that wasn't the wall, but a mirror. That was the first time I saw a bird fly in a mirror. Чучело. Как-то у мусорного бака я увидела брошенное чучело птицы. Увидела и не могла забыть, но она меня не забыла. Даже стала преследовать, куда бы я ни шла, с кем бы ни встречалась. Везде видела трухлявое чучело птицы. Вначале просто делала вид, что не вижу ее. Пусть является, мне-то что? Ведь не щебетать, не клюнуть меня все-таки она не сможет. Но в конце концов она совсем обнаглела, стала мелькать не только в открытых пространствах, смешиваясь со студентами и вольнослушателями, прохожими на улице. Появлялась в компаниях друзей, иногда и на головы родственников садилась. Тогда я попробовала по-хорошему, подошла к ней и спросила, ты чего здесь делаешь? И что тебе нужно, чучело ты? Но она только молча сидела, а отец, на голове которого она окончательно пристроилась, только вопросительно поглядел на меня. «Папа, у тебя на голове птица», я прошептала. Но он только рукой махнул, пойми, ну что тут такого? С тех пор я чучело и во сне стала видеть. Даже там от нее спасения не было. Я почти не ела, почти не спала, практически перестала существовать. И продолжала ее видеть, всегда такую же, застывшую в одной позе, немую, ободранную. Мне стало казаться, что она слегка улыбается, чучело надо мной издевалось. Я подошла, схватила его и швырнула со всех сил об стенку. Только, кажется, это была не стена, а зеркало. В тот раз я впервые увидела в нем летящую птицу. I will start with reading two new poems. How cruel is this month of COVID? Exhausted Karen crosses the river Letha back and forth in a crowded boat through November's dark, muddy waters, full of decay. Like a gondolier with masked Venetians in a gilded gondola during a carnival, except this carnival has many kings and queens to be put to death after the celebration feast. Halloween is over, but some characters refuse to part with their dress-up outfits. A clockwork orange in a president's mask continues acting like an autocrat in what was thought to be a democratic state. He screams, throws temper tantrums, hires and fires ministers and generals, spews lies. The servants cater to his needs. and a huge crowd of sycophants with semi-automatic weapons cheer him and stand in line, not even distanced socially, to kiss his ass protruding from underneath his too tight jacket. The rest of us are involuntary spectators on the shore, not indifferent, at times in awe of humans capable of sacrifice, teenagers of bikes taking food to elders and disabled in a lockdown, at other times in horror, watching stone humanoids unravel and spew anger like the huge redneck at the Grand Central Terminal who pushed my tiny Japanese friend against the wall, convinced she was Chinese, and she broke her finger in the fall.
Koks žiaurus šis Kovido mėnuo. Pavargęs Charonas iriasi per Lietos upę, pirmyn ir atgal, perpildyta valtimi, per tamsius purinos lapkričio vandenis, sutarštus puvimu. Tarsi gondolininkas, kartu su kukėtais venecijiečiais, karnavalo metu paauksuotoje gondoloje, visgi šio vakaro karaliai ir karalienės neteks galvų po šios šventės. Helovynas pasibaigė, tačiau kai kurie personažai nenusivelka kostiumų. Prisukamas apelsinas prezidento kaukę vaidina autokratą demokratijos spektaklyje. Jis rėkia, apimtas įniršio priepuolių, samdo ir atleidžia ministrus bei generolus, spjaudo melus, tarnai tenkina jo poreikius ir didžiulė minia sikofantų pusiau automatiniais ginklais šlovina jį ir stovi eilėje, nesilaikydami saugos atstumu, tam, kad pabučiuotų jam tiesiai subinę, kyšančią iš jo pernelyg aptempto švarko. Mes ant kranto likę nesavanoriai žiūrovai, nebejingi, kartais žavimės žmonėmis galinčiais pasiaukoti, paaugliais dviratininkais, išvežiojančiais maistą neįgaliesiems ir senukams, o kartais šlykštimės, matydami apsvaigusius humanoidus spjaudančius pyktį, tokiais kaip kad didžiuliais raudansprandis didžiajame centriniame terminale, pastūmęs mano smulkę draugę Japonę prie sienos, pamanęs, kad ji kinė, kritimo metu jai lūžo pirštas.
Lacan writes that love is to give what one does not have to someone one does not know. What does it actually mean? Freud wrote that love indeed is a self-centered narcissistic process. How would he know of altruistic love, he who turned his daughter Anna into his analysant and confidant? I guess love is trying to give what you think the person you don't really know but want lacks, or try to give something you wish you had yourself. One needs to believe that the object of desire is honest, or at least believes he is honest at the time he receives the gift he imagines he needs. Perversion, analysts think, is a need to manipulate another human being to get away from feeling dead inside, or to escape the ambivalence towards women that you felt as a kid, enjoying and also feeling discomfort about your mom's excessive jouissance. Now this man lives with 3 silicone dolls, Stephanie, his wife, a roommate, Kate, and a nameless girlfriend. They always listen to him and never fight. A physicist enjoys a network of former girlfriends. It's organized to perfection, with the exception of the mess he leaves behind. Oh, people, feelings, my friend used to say. The sky is different shades of blue today, and the wind moves the discontented waves westward towards the dunes overgrown with small vegetation, dispersed like clumps of hair in an unruly beard. The waves beating against the rocks, this is a constant. So is the midday sun. And so are the doubts and wants and the inability to overcome the resistance of human psyche to understand one another despite the aha moments of joyful recognition, like when 2 wanderers wave to one another in the twilight and one of them exclaims, "Finally, you are here. I was dreaming of you coming to get me and take me home."
Lakanas teigia, kad mylėti reiškia duoti tai, ko neturi, tam, kurio nepažįsti. Ką tai iš tiesų reiškia? Freudas teigia, kad meilė iš tikrųjų yra į save sutelktas narciziškas procesas. Kaip jis galėjo pažinti altruistišką meilę, savo dukrą Aną pavertęs analizės objektų ir patikėtinę. Spėju, kad mylėti reiškia bandyti duoti tam, kurio nepažįsti, bet geidi, tai, ko manai, kad jam trūksta, arba bandyti duoti kažką, ką pati norėtum turėti. Turi tikėti, kad geismo objektas nuoširdus, arba bent jau, kad pats tiki savo nuoširdumu. Tąkart gaudamas dovaną, kurios įsivaizduoja trokštąs. Analitikai mano, kad iškrypimas yra būtinybė manipuliuoti kitu žmogumi, kad viduje nesijaustų miręs. Arba noras išvengti ambivalencijos moterų atžvilgių, kurią jautei vaikystėje, kai mėgavaisi ir taip pat patyrei diskomfortą dėl perdėto mamos rūpesčio. Dabar šis vyras gyvena kartu su 3 silikoninėmis lėlėmis – Stephanie, jo žmona, kambarokė Keitė ir bevardė drauge. Jos visad išklauso ir niekada nesipriešina. Fizikas mėgaujasi buvusių merginų tinklu, suorganizuotų iki tobulumo, išskyrus jo paliekamą netvarką. O žmonės, jausmai, mano draugas sakydavo. Šiandien dangus skirtingų mėlynų atspalvių, o vėjas gena bangas į vakarus link kopų, apaugusių menka augmenija, pasklidusią kaip plaukų gumulai, netvarkinga barzda. Bangos mušasi į uolas, taip pastovu, kaip vidudienio saulė, o taip pat abejonės ir troškimai, ir nesugebėjimas veikti pasipriešinimą žmogaus psichikai, suprasti vienas kitą, nepaisant akimirkų, džiaugsmingo atpažinimo, kaip kad 2 klajūnai, mojantis viens kitam prieblandoje, vienas iš jų sušunka, pagaliau tu čia, sapnavau, kad atvyksi ir parveši mane namo. Dingo elektra. Tu man sakei, kad tarp mūsų viskas baigta, nebėra elektros, neverda vanduo, nebedega šviesos, juodi ekranai transliuoja tuštumą. Aš tau sakiau, kad viską galima lengvai sutvarkyti, uždegiau žvakes, ėmiau ieškoti vidaus saugiklių, junginėjau pirmyn ir atgal, kad galėtumėm pradėti iš naujo, lyg niekur nieko, apsimesti, kad nieko čia tokio nebuvo, nerimtas gedimas, viskas pataisoma, tačiau nieko iš to neišėjo. Užgesus žvakiams, kūdi tamsa, kurioje likau vienas.
Без электричества. Ты мне сказала, что между нами все кончено. Нет электричества, не вскипятить воду, свет погас, черные экраны транслируют пустоту. Я сказал тебе, что все это можно легко исправить. Зажег свечи, стал искать предохранители, включать и выключать взад и вперед, чтобы мы могли начать все сначала. Ну что такого? Прикинуться, что ничего-то и не было, мелкая неполадка, все починим. Но ничего из этого не вышло. Свечи потухли, и я один в глубокой ночи.
Kariavau lauke vienas, nes toks mano karas, nuėjau priešų skalpais, palydėdamas karo šūksniais, įvariau baimę į gardą, į kampą užspyčiau, tvirtai supančiau, iš kaulų išpučiau vėją, sukėliau audras, nieks nedrįso rodytis, išskyrus mano paties vienatvę.
In the field I was fighting alone. I was fighting alone in the field, such is my war. I was waving my enemies' scalps, screaming battle cries, chased them behind the barricade into a corner, chained them tight, kicked them hard, scared the shit out of them. No one dared to show his face, only my solitude. Один в поле воя. Воевал я в поле один, вот такая у меня война. Размахивал скальпами врагов, сопровождая это военным кличем, нагнал страха на них, загнал их за баррикаду в угол, сковал цепями, надавал пиздюлей так, что мало не покажется, никто морды больше не высунет, кроме моего собственного одиночества.
Idėja fix. Kiek pamenu, visada norėjau kurti filmus apie gangsterius, gvildenti moralines dilemas, pritraukti vaizdą, kai gangsteris svarsto, ar ta žiurkė palikt gyvą, arba kai paskutinį kartą susitinka su mylima prostitute, merkiant lietui tamsoje gatvėje, jis ją mato lange. Norėjau sukurti kažką tikro, kad plaukai šiauštus, kursiu mažą biudžetį veiksmo filmą, be kaskadininkų, kai mašina užsidegs, šoksiu vidų, gelbėtų sustrigusių aktorių, išsisuksiu lengvu rankos nudegimu, keletų nusibrozdinimų, tapsiu didvyriu, Apie mane rašys laikraščiai, apie mane, ne apie tos suknistus gangsterius.
Идея фикс. Сколько себя помню, всегда хотела сделать фильм про гангстеров, чтобы решать там моральные дилеммы, снять крупным планом, как гангстер решает, оставит ли ему в живых этого крысеныша, или как он в последний раз встречается с любимой проституткой, проливной дождь на темной улице, он видит ее в окне. Хочется создать что-то настоящее, от чего волосы на голове зашевелятся. Сделаю малобюджетное кино без каскадеров. Когда машина загорится, я прыгну в нее спасать застрявших там актеров и выйду из огня всего лишь с легким ожогом, парой царапин, стану героем, и обо мне начнут писать газеты, а не об этих мудацких гангстерах.
Komunizmas. Tavo mergaitė prieš mano mergaitę lygiosios, tavo krokodilas prieš mano krokodilą lygiosios, tavo ananasas prieš mano ananasą lygiosios, tavo kombainas prieš mano kombainą lygiosios, tavo trūksta tekstų dalies prieš mano trūksta tekstų dalies lygiosios, tavo sama žinutė prieš mano sama žinutę lygiosios, tavo Damoklo kardas prieš mano Damoklo kardą lygiosios, tavo Star Warsai prieš mano Star Warsus lygiosios, tavo Euripidas prieš mano Euripidą lygiosios, tavo Minotauras prieš mano Minotaurą lygiosios, tavo prieš mano lygiosios. Ir čia vyksta amžinos lygiosios, tai tas tienas rezultatą persveria, tai tas tienas jį išlygina, nes tavo yra mano ir mano yra tavo. Čia niekas nelaimi, niekas nepralaimi, mes nežinom, kuris yra kieno, mes nežinom, kaip dalintis po lygiai.
Communism. Your girl versus my girl, it's a draw. Your crocodile versus my crocodile, it's a draw. Your pineapple versus my pineapple, it's a draw. Your combine harvester versus my combine harvester, it's a draw. The missing part of your text versus the missing part of my text, it's a draw. Your text message versus my text message, it's a draw. Your Damocles sword versus my Damocles sword, it's a draw. Your Star Wars versus my Star Wars, it's a draw. Your Euripides versus my Euripides, it's a draw. Your Minotaur versus my Minotaur, it's a draw. One takes lead, another catches up. Nobody wins, nobody loses, and vice versa. There is no way of knowing which one is whose. We have no way of knowing how to share equally.
Yra upė. Yra tiesios kaip stygos moteris, visada pasitempusios. Ant jų paltų nerasi ne vieno pukelio. Yra vyrai su kostiumais, kurie susitikę visada spaudžia ranką. Jei šypsosi, stengiasi tai daryti apdairiai. Yra bomžas, miegantis šilo stotelėje. Yra netoliese tekanti upė. Yra krūmai, kalnai ir pakalnės. Yra neatsakyti laiškai ir šaltame vandenyje plūduriuojančios antys. Ir esu aš. Mąstant, ar kas nors bent kada tikrai žinojo, ką nori daryti gyvenime. Ir yra upė. Yra juokas stiklainiuose, nuo neatmenamų laikų paliktas mūsų mažose tamsiuose sandėliukuose. Apie pelies juokas. Ir yra spalvos, tos gražios dangaus spalvos. Jos keičiasi. Yra tavo rankos. Yra noras norėti tave paimti už rankos. Yra miestas, yra gatvės, yra namai, yra laiptinės, yra laiptai. Kartais mes lipam aukštyn, kartais leidžiamės. Yra naktis, naktį mes miegam. Yra diena, yra valgyklos, universitetai ir parduotuvės, yra ofisai, kabinetai ir galerijos, yra paveikslai, yra paveikslai, yra paveikslai. Ir yra upė.
Есть река. Есть женщины прямые, как струны, всегда подтянутые. На их пальто никогда не найдешь пушинки. Есть мужчины в костюмах, которые при встрече всегда жмут руку. Если улыбаются, стараются это делать осмотрительно. Есть бомж, который спит на остановке автобуса «Лесная». Там неподалеку течет река, там кусты, холмы и пригорки. Есть письма, на которые не ответили, и утки, бултыхающиеся в прохладной воде. И есть я, думающий о том, знала ли хоть когда-нибудь по-настоящему, что делать в этой жизни. И есть река. И смех в стеклянных банках с незапамятных времен, оставленных в наших тесных темных кладовках, заплесневевший смех, и есть краски. Красивые краски неба, они меняются. Есть твои руки, есть желание захотеть тебя взять за руку, есть город, есть улицы, есть дома, есть подъезды, есть ступени. Иногда мы поднимаемся наверх, иногда спускаемся. Есть ночь. Ночью мы спим. Есть день. Есть закусочные, университеты и магазины. Есть офисы, кабинеты и галереи. Есть картины, есть картины, есть картины. И есть река.
Pop. Sėdėjau prie vairo laisvame limuzine, galiniai sėdyniai, gulėjo lavonas kokio nors mafiozo, ar šiaip tipelio peršauta galva, o bagažiniai žaliavo krūvos banknotų, laukiu tavęs. Rūkiu cigarą, ratilai dūmų raitės it gyvatės, taip pasmirktelėjo, vyptelėjo, šyptelėjo, stryktelėjau, troškau spustelti greičio pedalą, kita vertus nuvertus, supratau, kad neverta draskytis, pradėjau vieną gyvatę, šį gėlę į liežuvio galiuką kraujavo, regis banknotai prižaliavę pražydo, jau net būdamas šitą žalumą regėjau, už mūsų stoviniavo policijos patrulis, lempelių žibėjimas, žiūri gražiai išsitraukiau pistoletą, liko viena kulka, baltos kelio juostos, baltos kelio juostos, baltos kelio juostos, vis lijosi vieni, netoliese degė raudona šviesa, degė taip skaičiai, kad net skaistumo pakintas rėžiausi pro šalį lekiančio reketininko Mercedesą ir numiriau. O kad viskas būtų taip paprasta, faras sekęs iš paskos buvo susitepęs, ypač ryški spurgos įdaro dėmė prie ženklelio, norėjau parekomenduoti jam miltelių, kad buvau miręs, o tokiems velniškai sunku prasižioti, taigi jas ėmė rašyti protokolą, apie žaliuosius nutylėjus, po to paėmęs pistoletą nusišovė, gal ir ne, bet iš kur man žinoti, juk gulėjau ant kelio, visas kruvinas, tarp patamsintų limuzino stiklų ir dar be abejo.
Bang. I was at the wheel of a pink limo in the back seat, a corpse of a mafioso or some other type of jerk with a headshot wound, and the luggage compartment a bunch of green dollar bills. I was waiting for you. I was puffing on a cigar, releasing snake-like circles of smoke. The jerk in the backseat blinked, moved, smiled at me. I shuddered, wanted to speed up, pushed on gas, realized it was not worth resisting, swallowed one snake, it bit me in my tongue tip. I was bleeding. It seems the dollar bills blossomed. I sensed the bloom from my seat behind me, police patrol lights. I elegantly pulled out a pistol, one bullet left, wide highway lanes merging, not far a red light, blinking so bright that it blinded me. I crashed into a speeding by me racketeer's Merce, and I died. Oh, if only things had been so simple. The cop who had followed me was smeared with a donut stuffing right next to his badge. I wanted to offer him some cleaning powder, but I was dead already. And for the dead, it's really hard to talk. So he started filling out a protocol, omitting to mention the dollar bills. Then he took the gun and shot himself. Or maybe not, how would I know? I was lying on the road, all covered with blood among broken glass from the limo windows, and still without a doubt in my head. At the Uffizi, among the white marble, Roman sarcophagi and statues of deities and sleeping nymphs, the damaged, darkened, crouching Aphrodite, with a dark patch on her right buttock, looks astonished, astonishingly alive, alone among the dead or sleeping others. She is barely covering her breasts and bush with long spread fingers, seemingly embarrassed, but actually quite self-assured in her easy smiling beauty, about to take a bath. Her slightly protruding stomach with light folds of skin. The crouching Aphrodite is smiling, alive alone among the others in this room, perhaps because she sees her lover reflected in the mirror, Ares, Hephaestus, or one of many others, standing in the entrance, stunned. choked up by the saddle.
Oficių galerijoje. Tarp balto Romos sarkofagų marmuro, dievybių bei miegančių nimfų skulptūrų, amžių sužalota, patemsinta, pritupia Afroditė su juoda žyme ant dešinio sėdmens. Ji atrodo apstulbusi, stulbinamai gyva, vienintelė tarp negyvų arba miegančių. Ilgais išskėstais pirštais ji vos dengia savo krūtis ir kaktos krūmą, tarytum susigėdus, bet iš tikrųjų ji pasitiki savimi, švelniai besišypsanti gražuolė. Jos pilvas šiek tiek atsikišęs, su nežymiomis raukšlėmis. Pritūpusi Afroditė šypsosi, gyva tarp negyvų šioje salėje. Galbūt todėl, kad mato savo mylimojo atspindį veidrodyje. Ar ėjo, Hefaisto, ar vieno iš daugelio kitų, stovinčių prie įėjimo, priblokštų, svaiginančio reginio.
Maybe we can talk about Lithuanian poetry, what translations mean for Lithuania, for Lithuanian literature, translations from Lithuanian, translations into Lithuanian, because I think it's a small country, but Lithuanian, especially Vilnius itself, has a very rich history of poetry and great poets that wrote there. So also wrote in 3 languages, in Lithuanian, in Polish, and in Yiddish. You know, there are famous poets that wrote in all 3 languages, you know, Czesław Miłosz, Tomas Venclova, Moshe Kulbak, and Itzhak Sutzkever, and a number of Lithuanian poets that are writing there now. It's, I maybe could compare Lithuania to Georgia. It's also a small country, but it also has a rich poetic culture. So Aušra, maybe you would want to say something about it, because you are now the vice chair of Lithuanian Writers Union.
Actually, I think for Lithuanian poets, it's very important to be translated, because for a very long time, and now I'm speaking about Lithuanian poets who write in Lithuanian, because like I mentioned before, we had very rich tradition of poets who were writing in Polish, Yiddish, and, you know, and even Russian as well, I guess. And, you know, but nowadays, I think it's very important for Lithuanians who write in Lithuanian to be translated, because in Lithuania, we have only 3 million Lithuanians, you know, and also, you know, some Lithuanian diaspora around the world. So it's not many readers around, and I think it's very important to translate Lithuanian poetry. And it's very important for writers, for poets, because when you're writing, you also want to be, not just express your ideas, but also to be heard and to find some kind of audience. And you can imagine that, you know, in Lithuania, we don't have very huge crowds who reads poetry, because I think it's hard to find, you know, in any country, very huge audience for poetry. And especially when we are talking about 3 million people who can understand this language, it's, you know, just maybe, for example, my 4th book was translated, I guess, in 700 copies. So it's not so many, but for example, my book, The Moon is a Pill, who was translated in English by Rimas Užgiris and published 2 years ago by Parthian Books in United Kingdom. I guess was published maybe 3 or 4 times, you know, more copies than in Lithuania. And I think that nowadays we have a better situation with all these translations and everything, because before it was not so many translations, because it's actually hard even today difficult even today to find good translators. And for example, my poetry is translated now into not 16 but 18 languages till today, and I am very happy because Lithuanian Culture Institute helped me to find really good and talented translators. But for example, to some languages like Chinese, for example, traditional Chinese, and also Cantonese. So my poetry was translated not directly from Lithuanian, but from English translations. And, you know, it's always a very tricky thing with translating poetry from small languages, because sometimes you should try, you know, to make compromises, because sometimes it's not easy to find like really good translators who knows original language. And I guess that, you know, now the situation changing, but it's still very hard to find these translators, especially from Lithuanian to Swedish and vice versa. Yeah.
I think also when you don't translate from the original language and you don't understand the original language, something gets lost. I've seen translations made from English. I translated Adam Zagajewski's poems, but I can read in Polish because I grew up in Vilnius, where, you know, my mother spoke Polish. You could buy Polish journals when I was in school, and they had more stuff that girls wanted to read, like, you know, fashion and movies, you know, that Soviet journals didn't publish, Kobieta and Życie. So I had both English and Polish texts in front of me. Simonas, what do you think? I understand that poets from a small country want to be translated. What do you think about translations of foreign poetry into Lithuanian? How important that is? I know you studied in Spanish, right? So you must know Spanish as well as Lithuanian, right? And English.
Yes. Yes, I do. I translate from Spanish to Lithuanian. And situation with Lithuanian poetry translated to other languages is getting better, but situation with poetry translations from other languages to Lithuanian, I think is getting a bit worse, because we don't get many poetry books translated to Lithuanian, actually. There are translations in literature magazines like Šiaurės Atėnai and Literatūra ir Menas and others, but we don't have, nowadays we don't have many translations, book translations, and I think it's a bit sad.
One thing that I wanted to ask you, I personally grew up in the Soviet Union. You know, I went to school when the Soviet Union was still there. And we grew up in an atmosphere that only when, you know, traveled to the West, and I immigrated very early, I immigrated in 1979, you understand that everything was covered with secrets and lies. We were lied to about everything, you know. We didn't know anything about the Holocaust. We didn't know much about what was going on in Lithuania. Like in official textbooks, they constantly lied to us about everything, you know? So Then when Lithuania became independent, it kind of went to the opposite kind of direction, you know, and it was a fight between Lithuanian nationalism and, you know, domination of the Soviet Union and especially Russia. So Russia is basically, in a way, a huge monster that Lithuania always feels threatened by because of, you know, Putin government and, you know, the aggressive behavior towards Ukraine and everything like that. At the same time, there is Russian poetry that is really, Edward Hirsch, who is the head of Guggenheim Foundation. I translated a book of his poems. He's a prominent American poet, said that when he was a student and he studied literature, he discovered that American English poetry was a little bit too dry for him, or something was missing in it. And when he started reading Eastern European poetry, Polish, Russian, he recognized, he found Marina Tsvetaeva and all these great poets that really made him feel that this is what he actually needed, a more emotional, more passionate poetry, something like that. So he calls Russian the language of poetry. And he was very friendly with Brodsky. So when I traveled to Russia to read with him, you know, he was met with some hostility in the beginning, because who is this American poet who is going to lecture us about our poet Joseph Brodsky? But Joseph Brodsky lived in New York. He was a dissident who was exiled and so on and so forth. What is the situation, say, in Lithuania with translations of Russian poetry? There are two poets from Russia. One is dead, Arkady Dragomoshenko, who is probably the most important poet of the end of 20th century in Russia. He was, they call him a language poet. He was close to American poets, but he wrote in free verse. And one of the living poets, Vladimir Gandelsman, who lives also in New York, he travels between St. Petersburg and New York, I think is a totally fantastic poet of our times. So I spoke to some of my friends in Lithuania. I think I showed to Marius Burokas some of the poems by Gandelsman, and he was really impressed. Does anybody translate those poets, or because of the relationship with Russia, this is all kind of forbidden territory?
No, I don't think it's forbidden territory, but I personally don't speak Russian, and it's hard for me. I don't
specifically to you, but
yes,
there are
yes.
poets, say, of older generation, all of whom know Russian because they also grew up in the Soviet Union. We studied Russian in school. If you didn't study at home, yeah.
Yeah, so there are translators from Russian languages, but I don't know exactly this situation. I don't think it's like forbidden to translate. It's not, but I think the situation is the same with all the languages. It's not like Russian is forbidden. I don't know.
Well, I understand that nobody has a prohibition. Thomas Venslow translated Anna Akhmatova and Joseph Brodsky, and he did absolutely fantastic translations, you know. Actually, Joseph Brodsky gave me those books, and he knew I knew Thomas, and he said, "What do you think of those translations?" Because he knew I knew Lithuanian. So I said, absolute genius. I mean, because these languages are so different. And he said, and what do you think of Thomas's own poetry? I said, I don't know how to tell you. What does it sound like? I said, it sounds like a mix with Akhmatova and Brodsky. So Joseph said, well, it could be worse. So there is a tradition of that translation. What poets, how can I say? So the situation with translating foreign poetry into Lithuania is not so great at this point, you're saying, right? Aušra, what do you think?
I think what, in Lithuania, it's very, very visible separation between, thinking with, about Russia, like about dangerous neighbor, and between thinking about Russia, like about, land of great art, literature, and all this kind of, things. Because many people who, for example, like writing articles about, Russian government, criticizing, Putin regime, criticizing, all the situation related with LGBTQ movement in Russia now. Yes, so in Lithuania, we have people who really, like don't adore Russian regime and Putin regime now, but they separating it from Russian literature. So it means that at same, I think it's normal. On some point, you can criticize, for example, politics of the country, main politics of the country, because even in Russia, are many dissidents and critics of this regime as well, and at some point as well to adore literature written by authors from this country. I don't think that it's kind of
I think in Russia, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a huge separation between people. They called those people that said Krym nash, Crimea is ours. They were totally like, they split into two camps. Like now America split into two camps, people voting for Trump and voting against Trump. I've never seen such, even like on Facebook, among writers, I've never seen such animosity and such anger and people insulting each other,
Yeah, if I may also jump in the discussion, because I see that's where Globus comes in, that's where our role is, because we are an independent bookstore in San Francisco that mainly offers literature in Russian language or about the former Soviet Union, which creates a lot of questions, to say the least, and we are trying to solve them. We don't know all the answers, and our discussion right now is a part of our answer, to be all inclusive and to bring out our feelings and our concerns into the light, into the open discussion. I'm right now in discussion also with Kevin Platt about a panel that will focus on the issues of the post-Soviet literature and how do we speak about it, because sometimes even our choice of words when we speak about it is not right and can offend some and doesn't work for everyone. So we want to establish this territory. And the other day we had this completely different show with Joanna Stingray, who was a rocker in the USSR in the 80s. And what she did, she smuggled the underground Soviet rock into the States. And her main thing was that she's building bridges, that the music is separate. And that's also to be discussed, how much culture could exist in its own space. There's no one answer to this from my point of view. And these days, everything is, there's an attempt to weaponize or politicize most of the things. And how well can we either resist it or find our own space where we are not manipulated one way or another in someone's interest geopolitically. So I believe that translation is one of these fantastic medium in which we are both very national and yet very global, because when Aušra, you spoke about Lithuanian, your poetry in Lithuanian being translated into English and from there in Mandarin, whatever is the better example of that. So I'm very grateful for this discussion and wanted to offer that. And from that, back to you, Anna.
You know, my husband is a Russian artist, fairly well known internationally, you know, a part of Comer and Melamedur. He traveled with me to Lithuania, and at one point, you know, he met with some Lithuanian curators, and they said, "Oh, would you come to Lithuania?" They met in Finland or something like that, and he has pretty much lectured and traveled all over the world because. You know, they were absolutely dissident writers, dissident artists. And when he came to Vilnius with me, he did just a few talks to artists and participants of SLS. So I was wondering, I know that there must people that know thoughts art in Lithuania, you know, and in art schools and museums. But I got a strange feeling that, for example, in Tallinn and whatever, like in Poland, in Estonia, maybe people are a little bit more open to anything that initially comes from Russia, even though he and his partner were arrested for their art. They did underground shows in apartments. They had to leave Russia, you know, and so on and so forth. But I just had the feeling that anything that comes from Russia is tainted in a way. I personally come from at least 4 generations of Lithuanian Jews. You know, my great-grandfather was a judge in Švenčionys. He was a lawyer, you know. My grandfather is in the books of doctors in Vilnius in 1912 and so on and so forth. But yet I spoke Russian at home with my father because, you know, educated Jews before the revolution and actually educated Lithuanians studied in Russian universities. You know, Smetona studied in St. Petersburg and so on and so forth. But when I had a presentation of my book, Vilnius Diary, in the Writers Union, my former classmate attacked me and he said, "How could you go to Moscow to study psychology?" And he said, "You betrayed us," or, you know, and then you married there. Who knows what did your father-in-law do during the war, and so on and so forth. So it was very interesting, and we had this discussion. And I said, this was my father's native tongue. You know, both my parents spoke Lithuanian. An interesting fact from my family life is that my father studied in Kaunas University, biology. And after he graduated from the university, he went to officer school where Smetona's son was studying. So my father is lieutenant, vyresnis leitenantas Lietuvos armijos. He was a bourgeois officer in Lithuanian army, but when he ran away from the Nazis, he ended up in the Lithuanian division, and all his life he was hiding this fact that he was a Lithuanian officer. So this whole Lithuania has such a conflicted, such a confused history, and I think I happen to be just one of the products of that strange history. What do you, Aušra and Simonas, think of all, you know, Vilnius? Thomas Venclova wrote a book about Vilnius that happens to be, again, a city of several cultures, and it used to be a very cosmopolitan city. You know.
Actually, I myself, I really love poetry written by Moshe Kulbak, and you know, and many writers who from different descent, and you know, and who wrote in different languages. And yes, Vilnius actually have very, very, rich history and also very, very sad history. Now I'm living in Naujininkai. Maybe you know this district of Vilnius. It's across the train station. So I'm...
yes, when you go up from the train station. Okay.
Yeah. But before, I spent around 10 years living in Vilnius Old Town. Mm-hmm. And in different places. And actually, it's very interesting because when you're starting to read about all these buildings, old buildings in heart of Vilnius, you learn a lot of things, like, it's like a history lesson, and you learn many sometimes awful things, maybe in the yard of your favorite boulangerie, like bakery, some people were killed, and you going and cross a street, and you just can learn a lot of awful things, but also you can learn a lot of nice things about people who lived before in this city. And I think that you are right, because Lithuanian history and history of Vilnius as well, it's like, very, very, how to say in English, like a lot of contrast. And and I find, some beauty in all these opposite stories and personal histories. And also, before, when you were talking about this situation, how atmosphere in Lithuania changed after, annexion of Crimea. The thing in Lithuania actually really changed, and this atmosphere, because I myself, I recognize myself not just like academic philosopher or writer, but also like human rights activist. And I remember that, after the things started in Ukraine, we also had some human rights protests in Vilnius city center. And I remember how, few people just asked me how much they are paying you. And at first for me it was, like, what about we are talking? And after I realized that, this is like symbol of new atmosphere who started after this events, because, some people in Lithuania started to think that human rights activists, are paid by Putin, to just make some chaos in our country and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I understand what about are you talking, but I think at same time it's very hard and maybe not right thing to do to generalize it, how you call it, like to make this generalization, because a lot of different people lived in Vilnius and also in Lithuania, in the past, and a lot of very different people with different, thoughts living nowadays as well. So you can also bump to your classmate who asking you, about language and all this kind of stuff. But also, for example, I had a very huge event, at Mo Museum. It's like a kind of new modern museum in Vilnius.
I know it.
Yeah, it's nice new building, you know.
Very nice.
And you know, this summer in terrace of this museum we had readings, I myself with another talented Lithuanian writer, Virginija Cibarauskė, maybe you know her. So and it was a very huge crowd, you know, maybe 150 or 200, you know, people in audience listening our poetry and discussion. And after this discussion, I was asked, you know, by one person from older generation, why are you writing this kind of nonsense? And how long are you going to write this kind of nonsense? I guess he also asked me after all these questions, one, you know, like, how to say, like punchline question. Did you read, have you read Svetayeva and all this, you know, like Silver Age poets from Russia?
Right.
Because you should read, because I guess, you know, that this person was, you know, thinking that everything was already written during, you know, this Russian literature, old Russian literature classics, and it's enough, and you can add anything else and anything new to all this tradition. And you know, and why I am mentioning this kind of incident, actually not incident, it was kind of funny and interesting, you know, because I think that it's symbolism, and it's also expressed somehow this culture situation in Lithuania, because all this, you know, people who usually trying to attack you after readings, you know, especially if you are feminist and women writer, and if you're writing something, you know, a little bit different and less poetic in this kind of like classical way, you know, they usually also asking you why you're not writing you know, like Russians did. But at the same time, almost all of them, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, are a little bit Russophobic. Yeah, Russophobic little bit as well. So it's kind of like interesting, a lot of contrast, you know.
You know, in Russian poetry, still there is a lot of conflict between people that believe that real poetry should be only written formally in rhyme and meter, and free verse is really not poetry. You know, I have a friend, Yuri Milorava, who comes from Georgia, Tbilisi, and he, you know, translates from French and German, and he wrote about free verse, that basically in Europe it exists over 100 years, and almost nobody writes in rhyme, but in Russia still there is a whole bunch of people that feel that people writing free verse are not writing poetry. It's nothing. Anybody could write free verse. To what I say usually, why don't you write it, and why don't you send it to journals? Maybe somebody will like it. You know?
You know, actually, I myself had this kind of experience, I guess 11 or 12 years ago, when I first came to St. Petersburg for my poetry readings. At that time, I had one readings in Anna Akhmatova Museum, and it was a very nice experience. I remember. Yeah. And I met a lot of, you know, interesting writers, and the atmosphere was amazing. And also we had a few more readings, and one of them, I guess, was in Russian Writer House or someplace. And also someone in the audience after this event asked me same question: why you're not writing, you know, in rhyme?
And Karina Snyder says, Anna, thanks for sharing your family story. And for people in Vilnius, I think your story is not unusual, just rarely recognized. And Marianne also thanks everyone and asks everyone question to Simonas and Aušra. What is it like for you all to hear your poetry read in English? Do you feel loss or do you feel gain? And I think that relates right to what we're talking about, you know, only in Russian as well, I guess I can add.
I think translations is like interpretation of poem, and it loses something and it gains something. And but really, it's Anna translation. Thank you, Anna. And I don't know, my poems are free verse, so it's a bit maybe not so difficult to translate. But of course, some metaphors, some words, some phrases harder to translate, and sometimes it's even impossible, I think.
You know, in my opinion, the best translators of poetry have to be decent poets themselves, because a poem only comes alive when it becomes a poem. In other words, just like what they call in Russian podstrочник, just a literal translation is not a poem. It has to come alive somehow, and then you need to change it or breathe some life into it for it to live. So you do read sometimes. You see, there are people that are absolutely perfectly bilingual. It doesn't mean that they can translate poetry. Sometimes I read these very dead, like lead translations, and it's very sad. They actually kill those poems, you know? So I don't want to speak about myself. I mean, would be very modest. But I think in the last 10 years, I've been doing quite a bit of translation. And the more you do, the more freedom you feel, you know, to move something or to change something. It cannot be done just so easily. I'm respectful to authors' texts.
I'm really jealous for all people who can understand a lot of languages. I hope one day I will have enough patience to learn more languages. Yeah, but you know, so far I can understand English, you know, translations. And my Russian is not good enough to, you know,
To appreciate?
to understand, you know, all this, you know, hard work which Anna did, for example, translating my poems, but I can hear, and for me this evening was very special because I had opportunity to hear how Anna reading translations of my poetry, and I really enjoyed this, you know, sound. And for me, it's also important thing. For example, one of my translators, Bayasgalan Batsuri, she translated my poetry to Mongolian language, and I don't understand anything in Mongolian language. But for example, when she was reading for me all these translations, I really enjoyed it. And also I had experiences when my translators were reading for me some translations, and I really didn't like the sound, even when I didn't understand the, you know, word in these translations. And if we are talking about my translations in English, I'm very thankful Rimas Užgiris, poet and also translator and philosopher as well, and a friend of mine. And I am very, very happy because I think he feels my poetry very well. And sometimes, you know, when he is translating my poetry to English, I can feel, you know, how this texts really gain new levels of interpretation, and how it's, you know, related with the context of English language. And, you know, I think it's very, very difficult and very, very important art to be translator, because when you are writing something, you know, like writer or poet, you just, you know, not just, but yeah, you're creating things. But when you are a translator, you should not just create things, but invent things and invent new relationships, you know, because the same things that works in Lithuanian, for example, sometimes it's just, you know, if you are translating everything just, you know, like instruction, like, you know, very literary meaning, it sometimes just sounds stupid and doesn't work at all. And yeah, I think, you know, but, you know, to be translator, it's something very, very special. Maybe one day I will try to be translator myself, but now I think it's very hard to do.
I want to say that I'm very happy. Actually, it should come out probably in the end of this month, a new book of my poems in Lithuanian, and it will be translated by two wonderful poets, Marius Burokas and Antanas Joninas. Antanas Joninas is translating it from the Russian, and Marius from English. So it will be kind of two books in one. And they're both like really wonderful poets. Generally speaking, I feel very moved when I read a translation of my poetry into Lithuanian. I grew up in Lithuania. I spoke Lithuanian like I speak Russian and English, but I left it at 18 to study psychology in Moscow University. So to hear my poetry in Lithuanian to me is very, very also dear and important. Also, one other thing I want to say, when I translated Simonas' poetry, we are very, very different poets. I'm a middle-aged woman. He is a young man. We write different things, but it was a lot of fun. I actually had a lot of fun translating his poetry. I think he's very talented. And you should really be writing screenplays, because some of your poems read like a screenplay, like bang. I really had fun doing this. So it's like, you know, when you translate somebody's poem, it's kind of like taking a garment, like a dress or a shirt. You turn it inside out, you see the seams, how it's constructed, and then you reconstruct it. You put it together again from those pieces. Translating good poetry is fun. I enjoy it. Otherwise, I would not be spending so much time doing it. There is no money, but I have to say that Penn just recently paid me $350 for translations, for participation in Translators Seminar, where we translate Russian feminist poets. I'm translating Oksana Vasyakina. So there is some money in this.
I want to add here that we have a lot of literary translations events, so a lot of our talks about it and what is translation. And I really liked what Galina Rimbu said about it, actually not on our show, but I found it while preparing. She said that it's reading your poem being translated is like looking at yourself in the mirror. it's not you, but it's the reflection. Question, could we hear some words, just one in each language, or a phrase, or hear about special challenges? Maybe we can pick up a word or a phrase or a line from a poem in all three languages and talk about the challenges of translating it.
You can talk with yourself because you know all three languages.
Simonas, how does it start in Lithuanian? You said you wanted to make a low budget film, right? About, you know, the poem about gangster films. How did it sound in Lithuanian? Let me see.
Kiek pamenu, visada norėjau kurti filmus apie gangsterius.
Okay, so a low budget film, I asked people, how do you say in Russian? Малобюджетное кино, or you just say low budget film? Because certain expressions, I don't know if they're translatable. I see Ivan smiling. What does he think? How would you translate that?
These things are tough. They really are.
Low budget film, because
well, that really sounds like something a 15-year-old would say, a very fashionable one. Malobudžetное kino, however, is also a kind of cliche. It's more of a journalistic speak, which maybe doesn't really sound all that poetic. So it's a pickle.
You know, when I traveled to Moscow in the 90s, and I looked at some translations, English translations that, you know, just a menu translated or something on a plane. I mean, they were hilariously horrible. I mean, people just always made fun of them because they were just unbelievably horrible. And at the same time, the language adapted a lot of English words. So when people say, you know, establishment, many, many words. At some point, this translation started getting better, but it's a challenge because there are so many horrible translations, you know, especially from English. You were translating some of my poems from English. Was there any line that was hard for you in Lithuanian?
My translations are actually drafts, so I don't know, maybe with Lacan writes, there was difficulty because there was, for example, first lines of poems, but it's actual phrase, I think, from Lacan, or isn't it? But kad mylėti reiškia duoti, tai ko neturi tam, kurio nepažįsti.
I think that in general, Lithuanian language and Russian language, Lithuanian language is very archaic, right? It's like it's one of those archaic languages that is being studied in universities. And actually, Thomas Venclova once told me a story about his student. He asked the student who was a polyglot, you know, who spoke 38 languages, including Lithuanian. So he said, among languages that you know, is Lithuanian the most difficult language? He said, not really. There is one dialect of American Indians that is probably more difficult than that. And Russian language, English is much more condensed and in some ways, I would say more constructive and more practical, right, language. For example, in Russian feminist language, now they are changing the words like author, like after, авторка, right? They say curatorka, curator, because otherwise, how do you say, I'm a poetess or I'm a poet? So most women say, I'm not a poetess. I don't write in a salon, you know, I'm a poet, I'm a writer. So in English, there is no conflict, but in Russian, recently new words appeared. Авторка, кураторка, shortlisterka, seriously, longlisterka, and so on, where you add a feminine ending to the word. So some people say, oh, it sounds funny, but I can see how language changes, you know. In America, there are trans people or people that say, I have a non-binary sexuality and I want to be called they or them, not he or she, just to say it. So some people feel it's an imposition on them. it's too hard to remember. And some people say our culture is changing, and it's normal that it's changing, right? There are certain things we don't do anymore. It does change. I was sitting, I had lunch with Eileen Miles, and the waitress came and said, "What do you ladies want to eat?" And she said, "I'm not a lady," to the waitress. And I said, "I don't really care," because, you know, she was trained to say ladies. My son is a writer. He's a journalist, and he writes nonfiction, but he started as a poet. When he was a kid, he was 12 or 13, I remember putting a record of Anna Akhmatova reading her Northern Elegies, Северные элегии, and it's one of my favorites. And he started like jumping and, you know, screaming like a kid and kind of, you know, as I said, like, you know, a parent from Europe, I said, how could they give birth to this son who has no interest in culture or anything? Then he grew up, and I took him to a Brodsky reading. Then he started writing poetry himself. So he kind of secretly from me started translating Anna Akhmatova's Northern Elegies. I asked Joseph Brodsky, whom I knew, would he look at those poems? So he looked at it, and my son sat and he translated one of my favorite, like her fifth elegy, «Меня как реку эпоха повернула». It's also about a river turned by the era. And I said, do you know what you are doing and that you are sending your poems to Joseph Brodsky? He said, yes. He said, most translations of Anna Akhmatova are written in very archaic English language. They are no good. I need to translate them into modern English language. And he did. And Brodsky wrote him kind of a glowing reference, which I still have. So I think that when you translate poets, language changes. And I think he's right, that you need to translate poetry into a modern English language. There are people that translate. There is a brilliant translator, Philip Nikolaev, who translates Pushkin, you know, and he can translate him into 19th century English language, you know, properly. I'm not one of those translators. I would not even dream of doing this. But I think translations also should change every 50 years. So
we had a very interesting discussion here. It was F Letter launch, the anthology of feminist Russian poets a few weeks ago. And there was a good discussion of afterka and the mutation of the language, and people brought different points of view. And speaking of Pushkin translation, we had Matvey Yankelevich show, which was brilliant. And he is my favorite translator of Pushkin ever. He did it to the music. So he caught something that I've never heard of any other translation doing for me. And I didn't know Matvey at the time. I didn't know anything about it. I just read it and I was absolutely stunned. And I staged it, I read it, I learned it by heart. It was absolutely fantastic. So there's something to be said to doing translation to the music with the musician playing with you right there, because poetry comes out of the music. So there's all this aspects of the language and music and rhythm. And we also have a question from our audience member on YouTube. And that's a question about translating Mezginaitė, and I hope I'm saying the name right. Did anyone here translate Mezginaitės poetry?
Mezginaitė was quite a prominent poet in Lithuania, even in Soviet times. I don't know of anybody translating Mezginaitė.
I think I was just ruminating on the beautiful interconnections between such various languages as Russian, English, and Lithuanian, all of them belonging to completely different language families, and yet somehow meeting at this crossing or juncture, which is Globus bookstore, as well as Anna's fascinating translations, and as well also meditating on the ways text circulates. The example with Aušra's poetry translated into Chinese, into Mandarin via English, of course, a fascinating instance of what we today call world literature, global literature, as a scholarly paradigm when we try to think of how texts migrate from country to country or from culture to culture. And I think very often people are, rightly so, I would say, drawn to blaming English for becoming this new lingua franca, the sort of the language by default, and say this is the language we're talking right now, of course, what has its difficult colonial subtexts to it, no doubt. At the same time, some good also comes out of it, like exactly those translations into Mandarin. And I know that is a very, very frequent vehicle for translation. It's English today, it was French 200 years ago. We know that Russian writers such as Pushkin wrote many of the European authors in French translations, and same happened vice versa when the French people read Ivan Turgenev's translation of the Russian classics in French. I think it's just instructive to perhaps consider not only the role of translators, but also the role of languages and the various steps that we take to understand, to comprehend, sometimes to put up, sometimes to battle things we don't understand or things we don't like. But I think that that's a very special moment.
You know, I wanted just to add something, that among Russian poets and or lovers of poetry, there are many people that have the opinion that, again, as we know, that poetry is completely lost in translation. So you can translate so-so poets, but you should not be translating these geniuses, because it just like you're just gonna ruin that. You're just gonna like whatever, destroy that. So they would often say, oh, don't even touch that poet, he's untranslatable. But when somebody says to me, don't even touch it, obviously I will probably do it. So I started translating Vladimir Gandersman's poems, and he's barely got translated into Russian. There are 7 poems translated by Olga Lipshin in her book. But one person who does support me translating that is Vladimir Gandersman himself, who is a total genius of translation. He translates Shakespeare. He translated, by the way, he did a book of Thomas Venslova in Russian that is absolutely fantastic, but with Thomas Venslova collaborating with him because he doesn't know Lithuanian, but 2 translators of that caliber translating, I mean, produce a fantastic book. So it's interesting to translate something that is difficult. I recently translated a wreath of sonnets by Arkady Dragomoshenko. It's an early, 12 sonnets written in 1974 when he's 28. It blew me away when I read it because his wife, Zina Dragomoshenko, put it out on Facebook, and I wrote to her, I said, Zina, did anybody translate that? She said, nah. So I did a translation, and I'm not sure how good it is because I've never done this kind of work. I did translate Arkady's work before. So to me, it's a challenge. It's very interesting just to see if you can do it.
Perhaps one question I would ask, which is a very sort of coming from a very different direction, but it just came back to my mind. This was something I've been curious about for a few months now. And this is definitely a question to all 3 of you. I would be very interested in hearing you speak about the sort of today's reception and today's situation, perhaps in Lithuanian poetry and among Lithuanian readers, of the legacy of Jonas Mekas. He is the author whom I perhaps even more commonly, Jonas Mekas. Yeah, he's his poet whom I perhaps most frequently associate the Eastern European space, one of the giants of that literature, even as he connects Eastern Europe to New York and New York citizen scene. It would be fantastic to hear perhaps a teenage poet these days coming into his own in Lithuanian, feels that he needs to combat Jonas Mekas. Maybe that is old, maybe that is passé, or maybe it's still very much alive. I would be really interested in hearing your perspective on that.
I don't know if he is a big influence in Lithuania. I actually heard him read at the New Year's Eve, Poetry Project has usually a New Year's Eve, not New Year's Eve, New Year's Day reading where like poets read the whole day into the night and you can come for an hour or two. And I heard him read just, a few years ago. I never attempted to translate him into any language, but I don't know if he's a big influence in Lithuania, Simonas and Aušra.
I can try to describe situation. It's very interesting situation, because Jonas Mekas, maybe it's one of the most famous Lithuanian artists in the world nowadays, worldwide. But in Lithuania, Jonas Mekas, and especially his texts, his poems, is not very good known. People know him in Lithuania mostly as a movie director and, a culture person and artist. But his poetry, in my opinion, in Lithuania is not very known. And maybe the situation a little bit changing. I guess it was somehow related with, different and very sometimes hermetic writers' communities, because Jonas Mekas himself didn't have, a lot of relations with Lithuanian writers and poets, like, personal relations. It's interesting. I don't know why. I heard that it's quite huge story about it, but I don't know all story. But Jonas Mekas poetry, for example, in Lithuanian press, culture press, wasn't apparent. He usually published his poetry and his poetic texts, like prose poetry texts, in one particular Lithuanian newspaper, and this newspaper called Valstiečio žodis, like peasants' world, about, like agriculture and all this kind of stuff.
That's hilarious. Well, this is mind-blowing. He's such a great writer. He wrote in Lithuanian, didn't he? He didn't write English, I think.
Yes, and actually, I really love not just his poems, but also his diaries. It's quite, of interesting texts. But now I think situation may be a little bit changing, and it's related with new generation of Lithuanian artists. I myself participated in, very, very huge improvisation concert in Vilnius. It happened after Jonas Mekas passed away. And after, his friend, very interesting jazz musician, Naujokaitis, just, with a very huge crowd of young Lithuanian artists and musicians, decided to celebrate Jonas Mekas' life. And so very huge crowd appeared, few hundred people, like, for improvisation. And it was one of the best jazz concerts that I had the opportunity to attend. And it happened in Vilnius. And yes, in this, crowd, mainly very like young artists attend this event, and I think this is the thing. And I myself, I am from Biržai, and Biržai is Jonas Mekas town, because, you know, he spent his teenage years and his childhood near Biržai. This is town in north of Lithuania. And actually now, after his death, he sent his archives to Biržai Library, and, you know, and situation a little bit changing. But yeah, it's a lot of very strange stories, and maybe I will tell the stories not here, but maybe in the future for you guys, because, you know, for me, it's a very, very interesting question, you know, how Lithuanian artists, you know, react to Jonas Mekas movies, texts, and also his heritage, because it's a lot of like very, very different ways how they react.
I wanted to ask, by the way, Aušra and Simonas, I think there were kind of two sort of movements or two lines of modern Lithuanian poetry, but older generation, Sigitas Geda and Tomas Venclova. And these are kind of two different, right? Classical poetry and more modernist poetry. And then there are other poets of kind of middle generation, like Kęstutis Navakas, who recently died. What are the influences in Lithuanian poetry, say, of Venclova and Geda? Are these the two main sort of lines of how it...
Simonas, it's your turn.
Yeah.
I don't know. Personally, I prefer Geda over Venclova, but we are both great poets. I also like Blože from the same generation.
Mm-hmm.
But as for me, I think I'm mainly affected by more recent poets like Jayde Kaziliūnaitė, Gytis Norvilas, Donatas Petrošius, and others. I don't know. Also, the very young poet who died in an unfortunate event, Mantas Gimžauskas, and there is one book published, and I think it is called Shamanas, title of the book, and I think this book also affects younger generation of poets.
I just find that Lithuanian poetry is quite original, you know, because I translated Geda, I translated some Kęstutis Navakas poems. I felt horrible when he died recently because, you know, he was a wonderful translator himself. But I think Geda and Navakas were very original poets, and Venclova is probably one of those classics like Joseph Brodsky at this point. He's you know, he's a Lithuanian, he's an intellectual of like world caliber, so to say, person, you know, as a writer, as a thinker, as a political person, you know.
I can totally agree. Actually, in Lithuania, we don't have, you know, many very interesting public intellectuals, and we can speak about Tomas Venclova as about, you know, poet from older generation. But at the same time, I guess that his intellect and his opinions are much more younger than opinions of younger generation. He is always very, very, you know, spontaneous, and he have a lot of energy to think and to rethink things that happened recently, things that happening nowadays, and he has very, you know, like interesting opinions about almost everything that's happening. And for me, he is one of the most interesting Lithuanian public intellectuals, for sure, and maybe his poetry is a little bit different, from that style of poetry why I personally, enjoy reading for myself. But his articles, his talks are very, very important for me as a human being. Yeah.
I met Thomas when I was a student in Salomėjos Nėries school, Salomėjos Nėries mokykla. We had this kind of underground club of Russian poetry. We had a teacher who came from a family, of repressed family. She had relatives. Her name was Rosa Glintershik. She was a Russian literature teacher who came to school when I was in 7th grade. And it was shocking because our teachers that taught literature were just, from Soviet textbooks. It was nothing. And here we had a teacher who took everything to a different level. She spoke to us as if we were adults. She was very smart, and to get a good grade in her class was almost impossible. So she organized this club of Russian poetry, and she introduced us to these poets that were not published in Soviet times, and half of them were prohibited. And she read to us Mandelstam, Pasternak, Akhmatova, Tsvetaeva, and so on and so forth. She was actually the first one after the fall of the Soviet Union to publish a textbook of Russian literature where she had Joseph Brodsky, Solzhenitsyn, and all the dissident writers. So she was in the Brodsky and Venslova circle. So I was 14, young Thomas Venslova, who was already a dissident, and he was like a tall, blonde, young man in a black beret, came to our class, to our club, and he said, "Children, there was no Russian literature before Pasternak sat and wrote Dr. Zhivago." My jaw really dropped. And then he started telling us that most poets of Silver Age didn't die natural biological death. They were either murdered, or they died of hunger, or died in the camps. So he introduced us to real Russian literature. It really blew my mind at that age. So, when I meet Thomas, when I met him in one of our, we had sat with friends in New York, I said, "Thomas, you remember what you told us, that there was no literature before Pasternak sat and wrote Dr. Zhivago?" He said, "Did they really? Did they really say this?"
Wow, it's a fascinating discussion, and I love how we go and branch out into everything from the public intellectual area to the arts, to politics and translation and language. And I'm sure there's so much more, and I know that there are quite a few people who discovered for themselves the Lithuanian poetry, Lithuanian language and culture, and I could see how in the future we might do more. Check out our Globus Books website for more events coming. We will be adding more to already existing list within this coming week. Check it out. There's everything from a journey of one family from Russia to Slovakia to America, immigrant focused operation, to the academic books on Russian poetry and prose from the beginning of the 20th century, to LGBTQ archives in Moscow presentation, and so forth. There's a whole variety. They are very diverse. There's something for everyone. Soon, Joanna Stingray's interview with some amazing photographs and some rock music from the 80s in the USSR will appear on YouTube channel. So stay with us, and I appreciate everybody's input.
Thank you for having me in this discussion / readings. I really enjoyed. You know, nowadays when I'm sitting at home with my cat, it was great party to spend this evening, you know, now in Vilnius evening with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Aušra. That was wonderful. I loved your poetry.
I just want to say 2 words. I remember that during COVID, the first reading I participated in was organized by Vladimir Druk, who lives in New Jersey. And I think we were so starved for like reading or seeing each other that after the reading, everybody started showing his cat. And Nina Kozman had 2 cats. So we were just showing each other's, I don't have a cat now, cats to each other. Yeah, it was a way just to support your fellow poets.
I don't have a cat to show you, but here's, you know, imaginary cats to the world.
Next time, I will show my cat.
Thank you, ZARINA. Thank you, Simonas. Thank you, Aušra. It was a pleasure. And thank you, Ivan, for your, you know, comments and questions. That was fun. And I think we should do more.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Simonas. I really enjoyed your poetry and yours, Anna, as well. Like, it really resonated. And I want to thank our audience. Thank you for being with Globus today. Bye.
So